Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So it's the top of the hour. We'll give everyone maybe another minute to log on. But yeah, thanks for joining so far, and we'll get back in just a minute. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the 2021 Real Estate Assessment live Q&A session. So hello to everyone on the line. My name is Kevin Kirby. I'm an associate on the member relations team. You may have previously known me working on the real estate team, but I've recently in the transition period of this new member relations team we have at GRESB. So we've also got several members of the real estate team on the line, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a couple of minutes. But with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. So just an agenda of what we'll be running through today. Like I mentioned, we'll start with an introduction to the real estate team that is part of the call today. Then we'll run through the 2021 real estate assessment updates. So the implications of COVID on the assessment, as well as the resilience integration of the previous resilience module into the main assessment. Then we'll touch again on the assessment resources that we do have that are available for your use throughout the reporting period. And then we'll open it up to the floor for the live Q&A session. And as a reminder, so with Zoom, during these Q&A sessions, we ask that you use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. The Q&A function allows us to respond both live on the call and respond to your questions individually within that section of Zoom as well. So yeah, we'll be using the Q&A function for today's call. Great. So we'll start with an introduction to the GRESB team on the line. So I'll start with myself. As I mentioned, my name is Kevin. I've been with GRESB now, June will be 2 years. Yeah, and I've recently transitioned onto the member relations team. So the member relations team is a new team that we have for our existing members, so both participants and investors. So myself, and then Stephen Pringle, who some of you may know from within the EMEA region, he'll be the director of the member relations team. So we'll be your points of contact for anything, let's say commercial related, as well as the respective regional heads. So on this call, we've got Asia Pacific, so that would be Ruben. But yes, thanks everyone for joining, and I'll send it over to you, Charles, for your introduction.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Vantier. I'm the real estate director at GRESB, which makes me responsible for all real estate related products and services. I'll be kicking off this session by addressing the impact of COVID on the real estate, on the 2021 real estate assessment. Before that, I would like also to mention that we do have Stephen Pringle on the line. So as Kevin just mentioned, Stephen is the Director Member Relation, which is a newly formed team at GRESB. So if you do have any question that requires commercial inputs or anything relating to sales, please don't hesitate to raise them as well, because we'll be able to address them. And finally, we also have Roxana Isayu on the line, who is GRESB Chief Sustainability Officer. And Roxana was very much involved in the recent change in corporate governance and governance structure of GRESB. So if you do have questions on that, also please feel free to raise them. With the numerous people from our side on the line, we should be able to address pretty much everything. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Charles. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. My name is Eric Landry. I'm the climate change specialist here at GRESB. I've been here for just over a year now, and I'm responsible for the content of our research, products, and partnerships with regard to climate-related risk, resilience, and our carbon accounting methodologies. So happy to be here. I'll be speaking today mostly about the integration of the resilience module into the assessments and how that works and why we decided to do it in the way we did. And until then, I'll shoot it on over to Victor.
Hi, everybody. I'm Victor. I'm an analyst at Real Estate. I'm also here for a little bit over a year. And my responsibility is the assessment development. And I might have actually interacted with some of you through fresh desks already. So yeah, I'm here to help and assist you with some questions. Thank you. Over to you, Kevin.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, everyone. So with that, I think we can go ahead and get into the topics of the session today. So that'll first start with Charles talking about some of the implications of COVID and any changes into the real estate assessment.
Great, thank you. So yeah, obviously a very recurring questions that we've received over the last few months is how did COVID impact the real estate assessment this year? And just to address that point, I think it's worth bringing a little bit of perspective on how usually GRESB addresses assessment developments every year. So just a reminder, GRESB has 4 benchmark committees, 4 regional benchmark committees, and 1 advisory board that is composed of large institutional investors. And every year, actually 4 times a year, we do engage with those groups to address mainly assessment developments. So one of the key topics this year that we discussed with those groups in late 2020, early 2021 was, of course, the impact of COVID-19 and how COVID-19 has had, should be catered for when it comes to the assessment development. And I think from those discussions, there were 2 main takeaways. I think the first one was whether you look at the sectors or the countries, there is no easy way to understand how COVID has impacted, let's say, consumption profiles of assets. If you look at office assets, obviously most office assets have had to shut their doors because of COVID, but not at the same time because they've been very much impacted by local regulations, which was very country specific. If you think about retail, you might also expect some sort of a dips and consumption decrease. But again, it might also very much depends on what those retailers sell. For example, essential versus non-essential goods. If you think about residential, then you might expect an increase in consumption, of course, because well, most people have had to stay home over the last 12 months. So just looking at the sectors, the main sectors that we cover in the assessment, you already understand that there is a vastly disparate impact on consumption profiles. The same applies to countries. I mean, COVID started in Asia and then spread it slowly to Europe and then reached the United States and America and then South America, which really means that there is no simple way or blanket solution to account for COVID this year. The second main takeaway was that for the recurring participants, or for the participants on the call that have reported to GRESB last year, you will remember that the 2020 assessment was subject to a lot of changes, a lot of developments, both from a structure and content perspective. Quick reminder that the assessment were restructured into components last year for the first time. So from a long list of indicators to 3 components: management, performance, and development. Scoring weights were heavily impacted by those developments, which led to somewhat inconsistency in scores over time. And so the second key takeaway from those discussions was, well, the markets was felt this strong inconsistency and these lot of changes last year, and it really does require as much stability as possible this year, at least in terms of input and scoring. Which is why we decided not to amend the 2021 real estate assessment to account for COVID, which means that you will face the same indicators, with the exception of the resilience integration, that Eric will cover in a bit, which means that as participants, you would expect the same scoring weight, the same reporting requirements across the board. Last thing to mention maybe is that we do have an outlier model happening at the asset level in the asset portal, and this outlier model triggers outliers. Again, outliers are not wrong values; they're just values outlying at an abnormal value from the rest of the distribution. that require a rationale, require an explanation when they're deemed outlier. Our consumption change outliers threshold remain also unchanged for now. So I think they range between 20 and 30%, which means that if you do encounter a change in consumption by more than, let's say, 30%, you will see that outliers will be picked up by the asset portal. Again, it doesn't mean that those values are wrong. It means that, hey, please review those values because they could be wrong. They could be subject to reporting error, for example. What we do intend to do on the GRESB side is at the end, after the submission deadline, so around mid-July, we will review how consumptions have been and emissions have been impacted by COVID across the board for all property sectors and all countries. And we'll see whether we can loosen some of the outlier, soft outlier boundaries to make sure that some of the genuine data points, although deemed outlier in normal circumstances, but genuine, would be included in the benchmark, because of course the last thing we would like is to exclude those data points since they actually reflect actual consumption profiles. So more to follow in about mid end of July on this, but for now, and of course, last thing, this would not impact your submission since we're not talking about the hard outliers here, we're just talking about the soft outliers. So this will have no direct impact on your submissions. So more to follow mid-end of July on this. And if there is anything else that you would like some more details on, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. Over back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Charles. And I think another thing worth mentioning is we do have Appendix 1 of the reference guide, which really walks you through the exact changes that Charles just detailed here. So Appendix 1 of the reference guide is a great resource. We'll be adding a bit more clarification text for the April 1st release when we're launching the portal, as well as the final versions of all of our reference documents. So with that, I will turn it over to Eric to talk us through the resilience module integration.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. So yeah, over the past 3 years, as I'm sure you've known, we've been collecting data through what we call the resilience module. This module is meant to explore and assess how real asset managers are accounting for different types of risk and resilience issues in their investment processes. So it was always supposed to be a 3-year module, and so since it started in 2018, it wrapped up last year in 2020, and so now we're integrating it into the core assessments on both the real estate, infrastructure fund, and infrastructure asset side. So this helps with the kind of consistency of, like we've been telling the market, yes, we're going to integrate this year, so that's what we're doing. And there's a couple of key things that we wanted to keep in mind during this integration process. The first is, again, as Charles had mentioned, the kind of stability, the overall stability of the assessment. So we didn't want to add too many indicators in, and then also the style of those indicators is very similar to what has been seen both in the module over the past couple of years and the style of the indicators that are already in the assessment. So a lot of those kind of checkbox click-through questions that we are very familiar with. The third is that we've been increasing alignment with the recommendations of the TCFD. So not only do we cover all 4 pillars, but also we at least a section of each indicator will go ahead and address each of the 11 recommended disclosures within the 4 pillars. So whereby making these assessments very much aligned with the overall spirit of the TCFD. So I could just go over really quickly what exactly this will entail. So a lot of the new indicators will be integrated into the management component. And within the management component, the risk management aspect. And you can see the name of the 5 new indicators here. We have resilience of strategy, transition risk identification, transition risk impact assessment, and then the same for physical risk. So we have physical risk identification and physical risk impact assessment. You'll notice that these kind of look like strategy and risk management type indicators, and they are. The indicators that will go ahead and address kind of the governance pillar of the TCFD, those have been basically leveraging off of the indicators that we already have in the leadership aspect of our assessments. And then also for the metrics and targets, we go ahead and leverage our performance component there. So really all we needed to go ahead and integrate were indicators that covered kind of those two central pillars of the TCFD, risk management and strategy. And this is what these 5 indicators do in total. So yeah, though we have the real estate kind of indicator labels here, we have essentially the very same format for these 5 indicators across the infrastructure fund and infrastructure asset assessments as well. So that leads to consistency of reporting across our different entities as well. One last thing to note is that these 5 new indicators will not be scored in the 2021 assessment. So at the end of the resilience module period, so in 2020, we had about 34% of our real estate participants filling out the resilience module. So that's roughly 2/3 that are going to be seeing this for the first time. And so we're going to basically, yeah, we're going to integrate them, let everyone see what they're expected to do in the coming years. But none of these will be will impact your overall GRESB score. Yeah, Kevin, I think I'm going to shoot it back over to you for now.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Eric, for the walkthrough. So with that, I think what we're going to do next is move into the actual live Q&A part of the webinar. So as a reminder, we have the Q&A function on the bottom. I can see that we've got 1 question in so far, but we did ask for questions to be submitted through the online form as you registered through the event. So we do have some questions to run through that we'll do on the call. And then also noting that some of the questions submitted were very specific. And so what we will do with those specific questions is just get back to you directly. Yeah, exactly. So we'll just email you directly because it didn't make sense to be sharing that with you know, the full group here. Great. And so as people are typing in the Q&A or you know, typing in questions via the Q&A function, I would just like to remind everyone of a few of the resources that we have. I know everyone's very much aware of the reference guide, but documents.gresb.com is a great place where you can find the reference guide, scoring document, as well as just the assessment in general. So that's just a quick link, documents.gresb.com, as well as gresb.com/resources, where you can find the full suite of everything from you know, reference guide, scoring document, the indicator summary, which the indicator summary also includes which indicators are subject to manual validation, as well as a scoring breakdown of each indicator. We also have the assessment in Excel. The assessment in Excel is basically, I mean, it's the assessment in Excel, but it mirrors what the assessment portal is like once that launches on April 1st. We have the asset spreadsheet, as well as a scoring simulator. And the scoring simulator may be a helpful resource for those of you that have not used it in the past. But yes, as a reminder, we do have all these available. We also have the GRESB training platform. So last year was the first year we used this online training platform. This includes videos on everything from management component, you know, the actual application of the management component. So choosing entity and reporting characteristics. There's an asset spreadsheet video. There's an asset portal video. A response video. So it really walks you through the full process start to finish. And so this can be accessed via our GRESB website under events. You'll see the 2021 real estate training. I think it's also helpful to note that this online training platform is a separate login from your GRESB user portal. So you will need to have a separate login. And if you have any questions about this, you know, you can use the contact form. And this is a reminder about our contact form. So at gresb.com/contact, this goes to our help desk system, and you're interacting directly with the real estate team and infrastructure teams through this link. And we typically respond within 24 to 48 hours. So it's a pretty quick response time if you're looking for a quick answer on anything from an assessment perspective, a technical perspective, accounts as well. So it's always helpful to come through the contact form, because then we can route the actual query internally as best as possible and as quickly as possible. Great. So I think what we can do is start with a couple of the pre-submitted questions as they're applicable to everyone on the line, and then I will move over to some of the ones that have been submitted live. So this first question, I'll answer it, but I'll read it aloud as well. So many questions refer to the entity itself. Is it allowed to include environmental policies in the assessment that are in place at the parent company level and therefore also apply to the entity? But let's say the documents don't explicitly state that they're applicable to the entity. So what's important here, firstly, the policies are definitely applicable to the entity, the policies from the parent company. And so during the validation process, validators can see the parent company organization, if that's the fund manager name. But what's important is when you upload the actual document, whether it's a cover page of the document or in the text box underneath the document upload where it says indicate where in the evidence the issues can be found. This is where it should be explicitly stated that the policies of the parent company apply to the entity that you're submitting. So we very much recommend explicitly stating that, whether in the open text box below the indicator or as a cover page, as part of the PDF that you're uploading. The next question, I will send this over to Charles, but I'll read it aloud first. So how should we treat tenant and community engagement events that happen annually but did not happen during COVID for our reporting purposes?
Great, thanks, Kevin. Interesting question. I think if you look at our indicators in general, we actually do, we do have a lot of indicators on tenants and community engagement, but those mainly refer to the existence of, in general, existence of engagement program with those parties. And which means that we would, and actually in terms of supporting evidence, we would expect to see, the existence of a policy or a program that aims to engage with those parties on certain topics, which means that we would not expect to see the actual events, as a supporting evidence. It doesn't mean that it's not accepted, but it means that in general, the scope of indicator really covers the existence of a process or a program rather than the actual events. And from that perspective, if for any reason that event did not happen, and COVID is a good reason, of course, it doesn't mean that your program doesn't exist. It just means that the event didn't happen because something else more important, prevented that event from happening. So I think it's I would say, if you carefully read the indicator, since we're not referring to the event but mainly to the program, COVID is the fact that COVID did not make that event not happening doesn't mean that you can't answer yes or tick yes to those indicators.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. Next question. So what are the criteria for a development project? And I will turn this over to Victor to answer for us.
Yeah. So a criteria for a development project is if any asset on your portfolio was or under new construction during the reporting year, but also if you have any asset that was under major renovation, meaning like more than 50% of the floor area was under renovation. So if you have an asset with both of these status in the reporting year, you qualify for like a development project and therefore answering the development components of our assessment.
Great. Thanks, Victor. And this also is over to you, Victor, so I'll read this one aloud as well. So will GRESB provide a scoring breakdown so companies can determine where best to make improvements in years ahead?
Yeah, sure. GRESB provides a participant with the output what we call the benchmark report, which is a breakdown per indicator and peer comparison that you can identify where you scored like in the metric level. And in addition to that, GRESB also makes available, as Kevin mentioned before, the scoring document where you can find the scoring requirements, and the scoring breakdown for each indicator that we currently have in our main assessment.
Great, great. Thanks, Victor. I think we can go to the next one, which is what are the waste audit requirements for GRESB?
Yeah, so like you can also find these requirements under the indicator RA5 in our reference guide, where we say that like what qualifies for a waste stream audit at GRESB is a process that evaluates the building waste materials, and it entails on sorting out, quantifying, and assessing if these materials have been directed to the proper area, meaning diverting the maximum from like landfills and putting this toward recycling and composting.
Great. Yeah, and like Victor mentioned, many of these requirements are specified in the reference guide. So if you don't see them immediately, you can always Control F in the reference guide, but looking for the specific indicators where a waste audit is covered, like in the risk assessment aspect would be a great place to look. And then we do have one more submitted question, and then I'll go to the Q&A function because I see we have a number of them. But I'll actually answer this one. So first, how does GRESB recognize the emissions generated and resources used in the ground up development process? New concrete accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions. Does the GRESB survey recognize and reward infill real estate locations for proximity to population densities and related lower vehicle miles? So this is something that is covered in the development component. So we're not exactly assessing overall embodied emissions from concrete, for example, as part of the development process, but we do have an indicator that asks, does your entity complete life cycle emissions assessments for your development projects within the last 3 years? And then you also report the coverage of projects within the last 3 years that you've done that life cycle assessment on. And in addition, in regards to the infill real estate locations, in the site selection indicator, which I believe is DRE2, so that's the ESG requirements DRE2, we do ask, proximity to, multimodal transit networks, as well as infill locations compared to greenfield development or brownfield redevelopment. So there's various areas where this is covered, although we're not explicitly addressing, overall embodied carbon data coverage, for example, for your development projects. Great. So with that, I will open it up to the live Q&A chat. And so I'll answer the first question here. So the question is, I'm currently working on a commercial office building in Australia and is due for practical completion at the end of June. Am I able to submit this for an application to GRESB, or do I have to wait until the building has been finished? So GRESB is a snapshot of 12 months of performance for a portfolio of buildings. And in most cases, I think probably 80% people are reporting on calendar year, meaning that what you are reporting to GRESB is all projects or all assets that have been completed or are in operation at the end of 2020. So in this specific case, a building that's completed in June would not qualify for the performance component, although because the building is under construction, as Victor mentioned earlier, if a building is under construction or major renovation, it does qualify for the development component. The second question asked is, I know GRESB ratings are applied to a portfolio of properties, and this is only one building. I think this is connected to the first question. But in this case, if the portfolio is only a single asset, that is okay, but GRESB does have very strict requirements that all assets part of a portfolio must be submitted so that the full scope of properties is evaluated, because we can't have entities relaying information on ESG performance of a part of a portfolio. It should be the complete portfolio. The next question. So what are the key changes to be expected for the 1st of April release of the reference guide? Charles, I'll let you answer this one.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. Good question. Again, ideally none. So the answer would be very simple. So we don't expect changes in an ideal world. And I think so far we actually don't have any changes. I'm just thinking of one, which is about, but it's not really confirmed yet. So don't, just take what I'm saying as with a grain of salt, simply because we haven't released the final version of the reference guide yet. There is one that we're currently discussing thoroughly with our data partners, which is about the estimation methodology. But I think what's worth mentioning here is that any potential change, if any, that happens during the pre-release and the final release of the reference guide will be communicated through a news item in the assessment portal. So if you log into your assessment portal, you click on your entity name, and then at the bottom of the page you have a very large section called news item, where we usually use that section to communicate on changes that happen along the way throughout the reporting season. This is something that will be at the top of the page as soon as you enter your entities on the 1st of April. Is if there is any change that happened during the pre-release and the final release, then we would communicate it on that page.
Great, thanks, Charles. So the next question, I'll answer this one. So it is, what if the entity is a joint venture? Do both companies need to have the environmental policy? So in the case of a joint venture, you can supply both or one, as long as the policy is explicitly applicable to that project and is made clear through either a cover page or within the evidence open text box. That policy would be applicable. So what's important here is that you are just providing policies that are applicable to the asset or the portfolio that you're submitting. So in the case of a JV, it can be either or both. The next question from Sunita. So we are struggling with how we must report on the developments that we hand over. We are a developer, and hence we do not monitor the data of the residential properties over time. This is impacting our score. I think this is a good question that I can answer. I've worked a good bit within the development component. So within the development component, the scope is actually just projects that have been completed or are in the process of new construction and major renovations during the reporting period. So the fact of not monitoring data of residential properties over time should not have a great impact. Within DEN1, which is the energy efficiency requirements of new construction and major renovation projects, we do have one tick box that says that you either have minimum EUI, so minimum energy use intensity from a post occupancy, and whether you're monitoring that, as well as some other monitoring methods, but that's a very, very small part of the actual energy score. So in this case, I think this would really be, for this portfolio, it should only be reporting the development component and not the performance component, as you're only a developer. Next question. So how about joint venture development project with no management control? I think this is one that I can answer as well. So with joint venture development with no management control, in the end, I mean, there has to be some level of, let's call it, authority over the project. And so what you should be responding to is which of the members of the JV are managing the project. Specifically with this no management control, maybe this is something that you can submit to us through the Fresh Desk, through our help desk platform, so that we could better get back to you. But typically, I think in most cases with the JV development project, like I mentioned earlier, you can respond from either of the either of the partners of the JV's perspective.
Can I interrupt 1 second here?
Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
From our, we're receiving a lot of questions, so thank you for that. Thank you for that. In our chat box, we obviously receive the question from everyone, which means that they all kind of are listed one after the other. And maybe that's the same for you. I don't know. I think it depends if you made them public. If you made your question public. Can you try, please, to at least when you send a question, try to send a question that is kind of all kind of self-sustaining and not just part of a question, which means that because on our side, we just received one part of a sentence that may be related to a previously asked question that we may have lost because we're receiving, we have now, 25 plus unanswered questions. So please, if you answer a question, try to provide the full context so that the rest of the audience can also understand the context that you're referring to. Thank you.
Great, thanks for the clarification, Charles. So this next question that I'll read aloud, I think is a very reasonable one. So, will the temporary shutdown for a significant period during fiscal year 2020-2021 be considered a reasonable explanation for lower use of resources in the case that it's flagged as an outlier in the asset level information. Victor, is this something you would like to answer?
Yes, so that's what Charles mentioned before. We still don't know what to expect from this last year when it comes to consumption and use of resources. So we're still not establishing a soft outlier upper and lower limits. We're gonna review this after the reporting period is closed. But yes, because of the impacts of COVID last year, it is possible that this you use lower resources, and this is a reasonable explanation for any outlier that is flagged in the asset level data.
Perfect. Thanks, Victor, for that.
I wanted to add to this. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a back and forth now, so I'm just
go for it.
interrupting a little bit. Sorry for that. Again, just wanted to clarify. The reason for outliers are not mandatory. We do flag outliers to make sure that participants review those data points just in case they could lead to reporting mistakes, but they're not deemed as themselves. An outlier is not deemed as an error. If you can actually go ahead and aggregate your values without providing a reason for outlier, and of course, if you do want to provide a reason for outlier, so that for each outlier value, you know why and what happened, then of course you can always select an other as an answer and provide shutdown of the significant portion of the period being the main reason, and that would totally be fine.
Great. And then there's another question that I can answer that's related to this. So if the asset is not operating for a full reporting year, is it required to report on the performance component? If yes, does it only need to report on those operating months? So I'm assuming the operations in this regard are maybe relative to a COVID shutdown. So just because the building was not actually in operation from due to COVID does not mean that it still needs to be reported to GRESB. So you would be reporting the respective energy consumption as it's likely, and emissions and water and waste as it's likely there's still some type of generation in regards to those utilities. But if there is an outlier flagged because of that, that would be a valid reason that you can explain within the GRESB asset portal.
And if the reason why the asset was not in operation was not COVID, but just because the asset was under renovation or the asset was under construction at the time, then you would simply define your asset as either new construction project or a standing investment. And depending on the period relating to each status recognized by the asset, then you would report your performance data accordingly.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. So a next question on a bit of a different note is, some indicators in the questionnaire allow documents uploaded, but not indicated as optional, whereas in the indicator summary, some are marked as required evidence. Does that mean that the evidence is not scored? So as far as I'm aware, within the 2021 assessment, the only place where we are asking for evidence where it is not scored is the resilience, the 4 or 5 resilience indicators. So in this cases, I would highly recommend just referring to the validation section under each, under each indicator, which will specifically say whether the evidence or not is validated. But in all cases within the real estate assessment, if you provide evidence, it is validated, except for the resilience indicators. I will note that the open text boxes for resilience do have validation requirements and are manually validated, but the evidence is not. So that's the only place where the evidence is optional. Will GRESB be publishing frequently asked questions and associated responses so as to minimize us submitting a question that may have been submitted by another reporting entity? I think this is actually a really great suggestion and something that's been on the table for GRESB to consider how best to really route questions that are coming in, because many people are asking the same questions. At this point, that's not something that will likely be launched for this reporting period, but we do have a fact page, an FAQ page, which is not necessarily technical, but does have a lot of answers around the assessment and from a commercial standpoint. So I would recommend everyone to check out the FAQ page, because there are many questions that are submitted to us that can be answered via that. But I think that's a great way of saying, or a great suggestion that we can evaluate in the future.
maybe also worth mentioning, Kevin, here, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a news item feature in the assessment portal that we don't necessarily use for listing all the frequently asked questions, but we do when we actually receive the same questions on recurringly, we do list them internally. And when there's something that either is not clear for a lot of participants, or that could use some clarification, we do post news items throughout the reporting season to provide clarification on those items. So and that's something we've actually realized that a few participants last year were not aware of. So maybe just worth mentioning again, we do heavily use this feature in the assessment portal. So you log onto the assessment portal, you click on your entity name, and then right below the button where you can actually enter your assessment, you will see a news item section. And in this section, we use this section to communicate with our participants along the way on matters that usually either are subject to facts, but not being facts as such, because it's not a fact section, or changes, for example, like improvement along the way that we do. So please be aware that this exists, and that's something that we use often.
Yeah, and like Charles mentioned, it's directly in the assessment portal, so it should be pretty easy for you guys to see. This is a good question. So what if one of my developments projects finalized construction works in mid-2020? Should I report it under development or under real estate? So I think I can answer this question. So if a project is completed mid-year, and that means it's a completed development project, let's use June, the end of June 2020, for example. So that would be exactly 6 months of new construction and then 6 months of operation. So in this case, you would report the asset within the GRESB asset spreadsheet as a new construction project, but it would be new construction completed. This means this asset aggregates to both the development component and the performance component. And for those 6 months for which the asset was operational, you would be reporting the relative performance data from those 6 months. So yes, it goes to both in the case that an asset is completed during the development process, excuse me. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to decide which one is a good one to answer next.
In the meantime, while you're looking for your next questions, Kevin, I can add on what you just said. So yeah, when an asset qualifies for both statuses, so development projects the first 6 months of the year, and then operation asset for the last 6 months of the year, just remember that always look at the instruction tab of the asset level spreadsheet. There is a lot of information there that is very relevant for scenarios like this. And one of the examples that you may wonder is where we also ask for the vacancy rate of assets. And the vacancy rate in that instance, and everything is provided in the instruction tab, right? But the vacancy rate that we ask should only relate to the last 6 months of the year, which means the operational period of the asset. We do not ask for the vacancy rate for construction projects, of course, because that wouldn't make a lot of sense. But just remember that some of the fields in the GRESB asset spreadsheet relate to the period of operation only. So I would strongly recommend to have a look at the instruction tab prior to filling in the spreadsheet.
Great, thanks. So next question, I think, yeah, very relevant is, and there's two of them that basically ask the same topic about local Chinese energy ratings recognized by GRESB. So I believe so far there is a Hong Kong-based energy benchmarking platform that and also the Hong Kong BEST tool that are both recognized energy ratings. But if there is a local Chinese energy rating that we are not, that we currently don't recognize, this is something that can be submitted through a certification evaluation form. So there is information about this within the reference guide. I think it's Appendix 5C is the form. Appendix 5A is the certification schemes, 5B is energy ratings, and 5C is the form you can submit to us. So in that case, you can submit the form to us and we will evaluate whether or not it's a valid energy rating. And from there, we can then publish that for your use within the GRESB asset spreadsheet and asset portal. So with that, I would recommend reaching out to us and we can work with you to have those recognized if they're valid. Another question. So all assets must be reported, even those that we acquired at the very last reporting month. Charles, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. Yes, all assets must be reported to GRESB. Now, it is worth mentioning that indeed, if you just acquire an asset, before the end of the reporting period, you will have less time and resource to implement measures or to do anything on these assets. Just keep in mind that we do account. I mean, when you're going to report that asset, you're going to have to report the acquisition date of that asset, which means that, let's say you acquired an asset at the beginning of December and you report from January to December, you're gonna report 1st of December as acquisition date. And on our side, we will multiply the weight of what that this asset has in the aggregation model by a 12th. So we're only going to take a 12th of the weight that asset should have had you owned that asset for the full year, that will count towards the final score. So we do weight asset per period of ownership. The reason why we don't allow them to be excluded is because, well, you can put it this way. Let's say this asset is rented out and you do perceive financial income on these assets. You would probably not reject that financial income for your profit and loss, correct? You would probably say, well, I haven't managed to do anything on that assets, but it's still part of my portfolio, and it should, as such, it should contribute to the overall score. So we don't, GRESB really makes a strong point on portfolio completion, and this is actually why in indicator R1.1 we do ask participants to provide supporting evidence that corroborates the completeness and the accuracy of the entire portfolio. And if you don't do that, then you can simply run the risk of participants cherry picking on the best asset from the portfolio, which will result in a GRESB score that would not reflect the actual ESG performance of the portfolio and would essentially mislead the capital markets, defeating the purpose of GRESB. So this is very, very important for us. But this is why we've tweaked a few years ago our aggregation model to account for these weights that should reflect the period of ownership within the year.
Perfect. Thanks, Charles, for the clarification on that.
Sure.
All right. So another question: how about assets already earmarked for divestment and still in the process of looking for a buyer? So this, I think, it builds on what Charles was just answering, is that if the asset is owned by the entity, it is required to be reported to GRESB. I think that's pretty simple. Second, what about a development project still in the process of preliminary design and submission stage during the GRESB registration by July 1st? So with a development project, you begin to report that project to GRESB within the development component, really as soon as you, let's say, have the necessary approvals and permits to begin work on the project. So really as early as the design stage. And from throughout the development component, what you're responding to is more of how you approach development as an entity. So just because a project is in an earlier stage of design does not necessarily there aren't ramifications later on within the development component that you would have a negative response to because it's too early in the stage of a project. Even for certifications, for example, we accept registrations for certifications, as well as within the development component, we accept pre-certifications, as well as once the project is actually certified in the case of a completed project, for example.
Kevin, I'm seeing a really good question here and there's so many questions that I'm
go for it,
because I think this is going to be very relevant for a lot of participants. Someone is asking, someone just adjusted or improved their methodology on calculating and collecting environmental performance data of assets, and the question is whether the entity should also modify the previous year's performance data in the assessment portal to reflect this new methodology. And I think the answer is, that's a really good question. And of course, since we do collect performance data for both the reporting year and the year before, and we do that because we do calculate consumption changes as one of the performance metric that is scored, the last year data is also very, very important in the context of reporting to the assessment. Now, for recurring participants that you reported your data in the past, then you would benefit from this automatic carryover feature that we built in the asset portal, where your GRESB asset spreadsheet would already be filled in with your previously reported data. If you have more data or better data, especially better data is very important, you're obviously allowed to correct and to adjust and to come and modify your previously reported data. This is actually happening very often when, for example, last year, in the last year reporting season, a participant had to estimate 1 month of consumption. I actually would like to refer everyone to Appendix 7 of the reference guide, because we do have an appendix on estimation. Let's say you have to estimate 1 month of consumption because you're missing on a month, or you're still waiting for the invoice and you get an estimate from your utility provider. 1 year later, so today, you would be actually have the actual data point for that month that you estimated last year that was not yet available last year. It is of course recommended that you do update your last year data set to reflect the best quality of data set that you have at this point in time.
Great, thanks. I think this is a good question. It's a bit long, so I'll read it quickly. GRESB requires participants to include standing investment assets that were acquired late in the reporting period. For example, December if you're reporting on calendar year. But the new owners have little time to implement additional measures, such as technical building assessments, efficiency measures, certifications for these acquisitions. Inclusion of these new assets will affect the portfolio floor area coverage for these indicators, especially if they have large gross floor area. Does GRESB allow for exceptions in these cases? I think this also comes down to a due diligence. You can think of it from a due diligence perspective, because if you're acquiring an asset that has had a technical building assessment or holds a building certification or has implemented glazing within the last 3 years, those would still all be applicable to the asset. So it's more of whether the asset has undergone these. Yeah, so if you've acquired it late in the process, it's an engagement process with the seller to understand, okay, well, what of the building, what have you done from a risk perspective? Have you performed a risk assessment on that asset? Have you done a technical building assessment? Because the old owner may have gone through these processes, so you would be able to report that in those cases. Okay, another one. We have a retail property that opened at the end of April 2020. Will this be treated as an operating asset or development asset? So in this case, if you are reporting both development and performance components, this asset would aggregate to both development and performance as it was completed during the reporting year.
There's one here that was logged recently. There are some investments that are only invested as fund, but not in the actual assets, and hence have no visibility on the actual ESG data. Is this still be required to be reported? So that's a good question, and it goes back to the reporting scope, our requirement on reporting scope. So reporting scope in terms of reporting to GRESB, one of the key requirements is to report on all real estate assets. If a reporting entity has investments in other funds, these funds are not deemed to be real estate real asset investments because they are actually financial investments in other entities, even though these entities may be operating in the real estate sector. That's the first point. The second point is that the concept of reporting entity for GRESB relates to the notion of investable vehicle or legal entity, which means that if an entity invest in other funds, these funds are also seen as investable vehicle or legal entity, which means that these funds, assuming they'll be managed by other teams, could also be subject to a GRESB reporting entity, could also be seen as a GRESB reporting entity. So to the extent that these funds could be reported separately, these participation can be excluded from the reporting scope. Now, if you take the case of let's say of a fund of fund that doesn't own any real estate asset, only owns funds, so participation in funds, even though these funds could be real estate funds, then the reporting to GRESB actually takes place at a lower level. It takes place at the fund level, and then the fund on fund would be there just to aggregate the ESG performance of each fund individually to get an aggregated GRESB score in that case. But I think the requirement really lies at the level of owning a piece of real estate and being an investable entity or legal entity.
Thanks for the clarification on that, Charles. So I just saw, I had two, yeah. So there's two questions around they're basically assets that are operational, but undergoing what they may think is a major renovation, such as to the lobbies, toilets, podium. Yeah, so what we define as a major renovation project is if more than 50% of the building's floor area is under major renovation. So if it's just the lobbies and bathrooms, that would still be considered an operational asset because it's really operating as a normal building would. In the case of a new construction project, that's ground up development. Major renovation is if really the more than 50% of the floor area is going through complete renovations.
We do have a lot of questions on statuses, Kevin. Don't we? I'm quite impressed by the number of questions we received on that. I hope we covered all of them. Not sure.
Yeah, some of these questions are a bit specific, and I would like to encourage you to reach out to the GRESB contact form. And we are coming up to the top of the hour, so let's see if there's another good one we can answer here.
There is one here that I see that was asked actually about half an hour ago. Someone is asking, this is more of a general question, I guess, but it's very relevant still for someone maybe who's not participating yet. And the question asks whether there is a research that shows whether there's a link between the GRESB score and an asset value or return on equity for portfolio level. And on that one, I think I'm happy to reach out to. I mean, actually, we don't have the name, unfortunately. But if you dare, I'm not sure if through the platform we can actually collect the email addresses for each question. But we do have a few interesting studies, analyzing the correlation between the GRESB scores and return on equities. We have actually one interesting study that was made in 2016 for listed REITs only, and another one for private funds. I'd be happy to share those links with you so that you can have a look. I think we often make reference to those studies when it comes to understanding whether there's a link between the GRESB scores and financial performance. And these are the two main studies that we most often refer to.
Great. And there's one question that was asked twice, so I'm sure this person wants me to answer, and I think this will maybe be the last one we answer today. So this is, since the waste from our site in China is removed by the government, which will not share where that waste goes, are we penalized? So I'm not sure if this is relevant to development projects or operational assets, but there could be extra steps taken, such as a waste audit, which would give you insight into which disposal routes that the waste should be going. In the case of development, you would have your own processes for this, but in the case of operations, if you're not sure where this waste is going in the end, I think there should just be as much effort as you can take to begin to gather that data, even if that's before the waste removal person is taking that away. But if there's more specifics, please reach out to us. And as we're closing at the hour here, there's a few questions left, but in the case of being anonymous, if you could please send us a GRESB contact form, and we will get back to you within a couple of days. And for the others, we will make sure that all of these are documented and responded to. And with that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. So thank you everyone for joining. There were a ton of questions submitted so I'm very impressed and with the level of specifics and really the amount of questions that were submitted. So thanks for all of the engagement from that side. Also thanks to the real estate team for joining this. and for all of the help in bringing this across the line. So with that, I think we can close out. So thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And I'm sure we'll be in contact soon.